أهلا وسهلا فيكم متابعينا بحلقة جديدة من برنامج يلا. بحلقة اليوم رح نحكي مع المدير التنفيذي لمعهد اتفاقيات السلام الإبراهيمية آريه لايتستون، اللي شغل منصب كبير مستشاري السفير الأمريكي السابق في إسرائيل ديفيد فريدمان، وكان لآري دور هام في الوصول لاتفاقيات السلام الإبراهيمية التاريخية. وبهي الحلقة رح نحكي معه عن الدور الحالي لاتفاقيات السلام الإبراهيمية والتقرير الجديد للمعهد اللي عم بيديره حول الفوائد الاقتصادية الكبرى لهذه الاتفاقيات على الدول المشاركة فيها، كما وعن تأثير مجزرة 7 أكتوبر والحرب بين إسرائيل وحماس على هذه الاتفاقيات، وإلى أين نتجه من هنا. للمعرفة أكثر عن كل هذه القضايا خليكم معنا بهي الحلقة من برنامج يلا. Thank you so much for joining us today, Arrie لايتستون.
Thank you, Abby, for having me. Very excited about the conversation.
You served as the senior advisor to the U.S. ambassador to Israel during a historic time for the MENA region. You were in the room for nearly every major decision. After leaving government service, you wrote a book called Let My People Know. Tell us about the book and the significance of the title.
First of all, it is so exciting to talk about a Middle East that can be peaceful and prosperous instead of the Middle East that we're watching right now. And that's actually why I wrote the book. I was sitting there watching TV in May, and the speaker of the State Department, a guy named Ned Price, was being interviewed by a guy named Matt Lee, who's a great reporter for the AP. And he asked Ned Price, the spokesperson for the United States of America, what do you call these agreements that the previous administration negotiated? Obviously looking for the answer, the Abraham Accords. And you can watch it online right now if you want, where Ned Price twisted himself into a pretzel to not use the words the Abraham Accords.
What do you call these agreements between?
They're normalization agreements.
Yeah, but what is the name for them?
Normalization agreements.
No, there's a specific name that they all signed on to. I believe you know what it is.
Look, we call them normalization agreements. That's precisely what they are.
Why do you not use the name that the leaders of these countries signed on to?
I was so upset because it was offensive to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in the region who have committed to change their lives towards peace and prosperity. And the United States of America won't even use the words Abraham Accords. And so I sat down that night and wrote a book, and I was saying, why am I writing a book? Mostly for my own therapy. Mm-hmm. And I said, what am I going to name this book? Well, what got me upset was, how could it be that America doesn't know that there is peace breaking out in the Middle East and there's a better way? So it said, let my people, the American people, know that by using our influence and our persuasion, we could bring peace to the Middle East and change the world forever. So let my people know comes from that, because that's what the Bible, that's what God originally wanted to be, the wellspring of hope, the Havy, if you will, yes, for the entire world.
And I do like how hopeful your tone is, given all of the developments that happened since October, and we will get there in the conversation. But I wanted to continue talking about the Abraham Accords because they are very historic. You were intimately involved with the Abraham Accords. Take us behind the scenes. When did you first hear about this idea, and what were some of the hurdles? And when did you realize that those accords will actually become a reality?
Fantastic questions, and we can spend a lot of time on that, but I'll try to truncate into 3 different occasions that I think were transformative, that if we were paying attention, we would see the signs. And the first one was President Trump made a historic visit on his first international trip. He went to Saudi Arabia, where he met with the heads of all of the Arab and Muslim countries. And then he went to Jerusalem, to Israel, and then he went to the Vatican. And that was a powerful statement saying that I am going to go where the 3 major religions come from, and I am going to focus on faith-based diplomacy. And he shows up to Saudi Arabia, and if you remember the orb, and they were all doing the sword dancing, and President Trump is getting on a plane, the Air Force One, flying from Saudi Arabia to Israel, except he sees that he's not flying direct from Saudi Arabia to Israel. He has to stop in Jordan. And he turns to somebody next to him and says, why am I stopping in Jordan? I just met with the King of Jordan here in Saudi Arabia. Why aren't I flying directly to Israel? And the person said, well, Saudi Arabia and Israel don't have relations with each other. And the president said, but we have relations with Saudi Arabia and with Israel. I'm going to fly direct. And the answer basically was, if they don't like it, they can shoot me down. I'm the president of the United States of America. And that was the first direct flight that ever flew from Saudi Arabia to Jerusalem. And you know what happened when he landed?
What happened?
Nothing. Because he's the president of the United States of America, flying from one ally to the other ally. And because he acted like the president, it turns out the Saudis don't care, and Israel certainly doesn't care. And so therefore, he brought a common sense understanding to what the region is going to look like. So that was the very first step of that. The second step was, when he lands in Israel, he goes to the Western Wall. Now, he's not accompanied by anybody from the Israeli government, because at that point in time, U.S. policy was the Western Wall doesn't belong to Israel. And he walks out of that and says, this is nuts. This is ground zero for the Jewish people. How could it be that this isn't part of Israel? And he then began the process on recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and opening up his embassy, the embassy of the United States of America, in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And what wound up happening? Again, nothing. America put our embassy where it needed to go. And what did all of the Arab countries around the region decide? Well, it's America's choice. So what America wants to do, that's fine. So that was step two. And then step three was, I remember exactly where I was sitting, was in June of 2020. I was sitting with somebody from the Prime Minister of Israel's office, coordinating relief for COVID from the United Arab Emirates, headed towards the Palestinian Authority. And if you remember COVID, all the airports were shut. You couldn't get anywhere. And before the vaccines, all anybody wanted to get were respirators and all the other stuff that people needed to protect their people. And the United Arab Emirates sent a generous, enormous airplane filled with lots of COVID relief to the Palestinian Authority. And what did the Palestinian Authority do? They said, we don't want it. Why don't we want it? Our people are dying. We need it. Why don't I want it? Well, because your plane landed at Ben Gurion, the airport in Israel. And if your plane landed in Israel, that means that you might recognize Israel. So I don't want your stuff. And the insanity of that statement, that I would rather have my people die than have the stuff to protect against COVID land at an airport of a country next to me, the state of Israel, that was nuts. And when that message got back to the Emiratis, it was very clear that there was an opportunity in this region. And this is the message that I really want to leave you with, because I think it is hopeful. There are two different tracks happening in the Middle East. Those that want to look forward for the next 50 years, and those who only want to look backwards over the last 50 years. I can promise you, time machines are not yet invented. So looking backwards does you no good. You have to look forward. And when you look at countries like the United Arab Emirates, like the Kingdom of Bahrain, like the Kingdom of Morocco, like Saudi Arabia and the State of Israel, the future is bright.
You are now the executive director of the Abraham Accords Peace Institute, which has recently released a very positive report on the continuation of the progress between all the Abraham Accord countries in terms of their economic cooperation and cooperation on many levels, which is really beneficial to these countries. What are some of the highlights of this report?
Number one highlight is that the air traffic in between the State of Israel and United Arab Emirates cleared more than 1.25 million people in the year 2023. And that's with 3 months of that year being clouded by war. If you can imagine, prior to the Abraham Accords, not a single person traveled commercially in between the State of Israel and the United Arab Emirates. What does that mean to tourism? What does that mean to investments? What does that mean to people cultural exchanges? It's not just Israelis and Emiratis. It's Indonesians, it's Americans, it's Canadians, it's French, it's German. This is the Middle East that is supposed to happen, where you can land in one place and travel without any problems to other places. Imagine what that Middle East ultimately looks like. So that's one highlight. Secondly, is there's obviously a lot of trade. And the trade is fantastic. For the economist sitting at home, I will try not to bore you, but I will make one very clear comment. Before the Abraham Accords, there was enormous amount of regulation between the countries. And what I mean by regulation, I mean that you couldn't trade in between the countries. So it was an impossibility to deal with these countries that are both looking towards the future. So that made it unnatural. What happened with the Abraham Accords, it was a deregulation. And if you look in any economy that deregulates an industry, suddenly you see that things can move faster, better, cheaper. And when things move faster, better, cheaper, all people are able to succeed and to benefit from that. And that is what is happening in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords. And if you look at Morocco and Bahrain and Kosovo, the rising tide is raising truly all ships, and all of those countries are advancing and benefiting from this great trade as well.
Now, I wanted to ask you, the Trump administration, like previous American administration, launched a vision to improve the lives of the Palestinians, which seems to be that every American administration tries to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but hasn't succeeded. How was the Trump administration plan different from previous proposals, and why did it fall short in the end?
The plan was different because it was realistic. The very first thing that President Trump, Ambassador Friedman, Jared Kushner, and others did was to say, let's find out what's realistic. Because if we're going to spend any time on something, we may as well spend time on something that can actually happen. And they developed a plan that at that time, which is now 5 years ago, was both realistic and opportunistic. Why did it not succeed? It did not succeed because the Palestinian leadership are not interested in peace. The Palestinian leadership are not interested in a state. The Palestinian leadership are not interested in the Palestinian people. The Palestinian leadership, both Hamas as well as the Palestinian Authority, are mafia families that run a crime organization. The Palestinian people deserve better. And they deserve better, starting with an education that teaches them not to need to kill Jews. It deserves an incentive structure that doesn't pay them to kill Jews and Westerners. You can look through the rest of the Middle East and say who was forward-leaning and who was backward-leaning. And the number one backward-leaning leadership in the world are the Palestinian leadership. And I feel badly for the Palestinian people because they are the victims of this horrendous leadership. And it'll take at least a generation to change the mindset of the people who have been brought up under this consistent leadership for decades. Now contrast that with the leadership of these fantastic countries like the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and what Saudi Arabia is doing right now, and it's all about leadership.
Now we are in a different time in history following the October 7th massacre. As a peacemaker, you've worked so hard on bridging divides in the region. What was your response to the events of that day?
As a human being, anybody with a heart and or a soul needs to be crushed. That other human beings would be able to perpetrate these acts of violence of such horrific nature, that these people have mothers and fathers. And the WhatsApp call that resonates in my ears when I can't fall asleep at night was the kid calling his mom and dad saying, how proud are you of me that with my own hands I murdered 9 Jews, and the mother and father were celebrating that.
يابا انا قاعد بكلمك من جوبا بسيم، افتح الواتس تبعه قول له وين، شوف كيف القتلى، شوف كيف قتلت بيدي يابا، ابنك قتل يهود، هاي دخلوا فلسطين يابا. الله اكبر، ربنا يحميك يا رب، ربنا يحميك يابا، ربنا يحميك يابا. قاعد بكلمك من جوال يهودية، قتلتها وقتلت جوزها، الله اكبر، الله اكبر ولله الحمد. الله اكبر ولله الحمد. يابا افتح الواتس شوف كيف قتلت يابا، افتح بتدوس عليك واتس قول له وين بروح. ربنا يوفقك بالسلامة يابا، أجوبة بسيم يابا، يابا والله 10 قتلت، 10 بيدي يابا، يابا على ايدي، اعطيني امي يما يحميك يما، طول الليل 10 بيدي يابا، 10 يلا بيدي قتلت.
Where have we gone wrong as a civilization? And then you have in Harvard and Columbia and Yale and Princeton, they're protesting not for the people who were victimized, who were raped, who were murdered, who were kidnapped, but on behalf of the rapists, the kidnappers, and the murderers. And that's crazy. None of the people protesting in any of those campuses care about the Palestinian people. They do not. They do not. They're useful idiots who know literally nothing about anything in the Middle East. But anybody who cares about the Palestinian people, anybody who actually cares about the Palestinian people would be standing there cheering and rooting on the Israeli army to free the Palestinian people from Hamas.